This is for every woman who was told her past made her less by the person who was supposed to protect her from ever believing that. My name is Emma Sorensen. I'm 29 years old. 2 months ago at my parents' dinner table, my mother looked directly at my boyfriend and said, "You should know what you're getting into. Emma comes with baggage, a failed marriage, a kid, a restraining order in her file. Damaged goods, really, if I'm being honest." She said it with a smile, the kind she uses in front of company. She had no idea that the man sitting across from her quietly setting down his fork was the son of the attorney who'd spent 3 years fighting for free to get me and my daughter out alive. If this story is already hitting you somewhere personal, hit subscribe and drop where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I read every single comment. Let me take you back to how we got to that table, because what my mother said that night didn't come from nowhere. It came from 6 years of quietly deciding my survival was something to be embarrassed about, one sideways comment at a time, until it finally hardened into words cruel enough to say out loud in front of a stranger. I married my first husband, Kyle Bennett, at 22, 2 years out of college. Both of us young and certain we knew what we were building. We met at a coworker's housewarming party, and he was charming in the specific way that made everyone around him feel like the most interesting person in the room. A trait I mistook for genuine warmth for far longer than I want to admit. My daughter Maddie was born when I was 24, a difficult delivery followed by the kind of exhausted, disoriented first year most new parents describe, except mine came with an added layer I didn't yet have language for. By 25, I understood I'd married a man who controlled every dollar I touched, requiring receipts for groceries, questioning every purchase, eventually taking my name off our joint checking account entirely, and calling it simplifying things. He tracked my phone under the guise of just wanting to know I'm safe, checked my call logs, grew furious if I spoke too long with a male coworker on the phone. He isolated me slowly from friends first by criticizing them one by one until seeing them felt like more trouble than it was worth, then by scheduling things that made plans with anyone else nearly impossible. And on 3 separate occasions documented in a police report I still have folded in a manila envelope in my closet, he put his hands on me hard enough to leave marks I had to explain away to coworkers with long sleeves in July, inventing stories about clumsiness that got harder to make convincing each time. My mother Diane knew some of it, not all of it, but enough. I'd mentioned carefully over the years small pieces of what was happening, testing the water each time to see if she'd hear it. She never quite did. When I finally left in the middle of the night, Maddie asleep in the back seat of my car, a diaper bag and 2 suitcases hastily packed while Kyle was out with friends. I called my parents from a gas station 40 miles outside town, hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. My mother's first question wasn't whether I was safe. It was, "Emma, are you sure you're not overreacting? Marriage is hard for everyone." I hung up, eventually drove another hour before I let myself cry, parked in a Walmart lot with Maddie still asleep in her car seat. I stayed at a friend's apartment for 3 weeks before I found a domestic violence legal aid clinic that took my case pro bono because I had exactly $340 to my name and a 2-year-old who needed stability more than I needed to process what had just happened to me. I remember sitting in that clinic's waiting room filling out an intake form with hands that still hadn't fully stopped shaking, wondering if anyone would actually believe the version of events I was about to describe, half expecting the same skepticism my own mother had already given me over the phone. The attorney who took my case was a partner at a firm downtown, a man who ran the clinic's pro bono program, personally reviewing every intake file himself before assigning it. His name was Thomas Whitfield. I met him exactly twice in person during those 3 years, once at the initial consultation, once at the final custody hearing, but his firm's associates handled the day-to-day work under his direct oversight, and I later learned he'd specifically flagged my file for extra attention after reading the police reports, a detail I wouldn't understand the full weight of until much later. It took 3 years, 2 continuances, and 1 terrifying hearing where Kyle's own attorney tried to paint me as unstable, unreliable, exaggerating for sympathy before I got full custody and a permanent protective order. I remember sitting on that witness stand, Kyle's attorney asking pointed, condescending questions, designed to make me sound hysterical instead of credible, and how it felt like drowning in real time while trying to answer calmly. My mother came to exactly one hearing, sat in the back, and told me afterward that she hoped this would finally settle things down. Like the previous 3 years had been an inconvenience she was waiting to end, not something that had nearly cost me my life. I rebuilt slowly after that. I finished my accounting certification through night classes while working a full-time receptionist job during the day. Maddie and daycare on a sliding scale rate I qualified for through the same clinic that had handled my case. It took 2 years to land a stable position at a mid-sized accounting firm, and another year before, I felt financially secure enough to move into a small 2-bedroom apartment with Maddie, now 7, who'd started to forget most of what those early years had actually looked like, which felt like the only real mercy in the whole story. My mother, over those years, developed a specific way of talking about my past whenever it came up at family gatherings, never directly, always sideways. "Emma's had such a hard road," she'd say to relatives in a tone that managed to sound sympathetic, while somehow implying the hardness was partly a character flaw. She introduced me at my cousin's wedding as my daughter, the one who's had some struggles in front of people I'd never met, like my divorce was a permanent identifying feature instead of something I'd survived. I remember standing there smiling through it the way you learn to smile through things you don't have the energy to correct in front of an audience. I met Ryan Whitfield at a mutual friend's barbecue 18 months ago, both of us hovering near the drinks table for slightly too long before someone finally introduced us. He worked as an architect, quiet and steady in a way that felt unfamiliar. After Kyle patient with Maddie in a way that never once felt performative, he'd get down on the floor and build elaborate block towers with her for an hour without checking his phone, once something I noticed, and quietly filed away as significant long before I admitted to myself how much it mattered. He knew early on about my divorce, about the protective order, about the 3 hardest years of my life, and he never once treated any of it like information that changed how he saw me, never flinched, never asked the kind of probing questions that made me feel like a case study instead of a person. I didn't know for most of those 18 months that his last name carried any particular weight. Whitfield is common enough. I never once connected it to the attorney whose name I'd seen on court filings years earlier, mostly because I'd tried hard not to think about that period of my life at all once it was finally over, filing the details away somewhere I didn't have to look at them directly anymore. My mother invited Ryan and me to dinner in March, framing it as finally getting to properly meet him, though I recognized the tone underneath the invitation, the same tone she used whenever she was preparing to perform concern about my life choices in front of an audience. Maddie stayed at a friend's house that night, a sleepover we'd planned weeks earlier, which turned out to be the only small mercy of the whole evening. We arrived at 6:30. My father made drinks, gin and tonics in the good glasses, the ones reserved for occasions where impressions mattered more than comfort. My mother had set the table formally, good china cloth napkins folded into shapes she'd learned from some magazine years ago. Conversation started easily enough: Ryan's work as an architect, his family in Connecticut. Small talk about the unusually warm March weather. My father asking Ryan genuine questions about a building renovation project he was overseeing downtown. Then my mother, refilling wine glasses, turned the conversation toward me in the specific way she always did, sideways, dressed up as helpfulness. "Ryan, I just think it's important you go in with your eyes open," she said, setting the bottle down carefully like she was about to deliver something considerate instead of cruel. "Emma comes with baggage, a failed marriage, a kid, a restraining order in her file." She smiled, the kind she uses in front of company, warm on the surface, cold underneath. Damaged goods, really, if I'm being honest. I just want you to know what you're actually taking on. The table went quiet in a way I recognized immediately, the specific silence of people deciding whether to react or wait it out. My father looked down at his plate, his jaw tightening slightly, though he didn't say anything yet. Ryan set his fork down carefully, the way people do when they're deciding exactly how to respond, instead of reacting on instinct. His eyes steady on my mother's face. "That's an interesting way to describe someone who survived what she survived," he said, his voice even unhurried, though I could hear something firm underneath it. My mother laughed a short, dismissive sound, waving her hand slightly like she was brushing away a fly. I'm just being honest, dear. It's important information for a serious relationship. You deserve to know what you're getting into before things go too far. It is important information, Ryan agreed, nodding slowly, though I'd frame it a little differently. Emma left an abusive marriage with a toddler and $340 to her name, fought a 3-year custody battle against a man with significantly more resources than she had, sat through a hearing where his attorney tried to paint her as unstable on the stand, and came out the other side with full custody and her daughter safe. That's not baggage. That's the hardest, bravest thing I've ever heard anyone actually live through. My mother's smile faltered slightly, her hand tightening around her wine glass. Well, I don't know all the details. I do, Ryan said, his voice quiet but clear. Because the attorney who ran her pro bono case, the one who personally flagged her file for extra attention after reading the police reports, was my father. The room went completely still. My mother's wine glass paused halfway to her mouth. Your father? Thomas Whitfield, Ryan said. He's run the Legal Aid Clinic's domestic violence program for almost 20 years. He talks about cases sometimes in general terms, never names. But I remember him mentioning a case a few years back, a young mother, a toddler, a particularly aggressive opposing counsel trying to paint her as unstable during the custody hearing. He said it was one of the ones that stuck with him. When Emma first told me about her case, the timeline matched. I didn't say anything for a long time, because I wasn't sure, and it felt like something she should confirm on her own terms, not something I should bring up first. I stared at him, processing this alongside my mother, my own understanding of the last 18 months quietly rearranging itself in real time. I called him last week, Ryan continued after Mom mentioned we were coming to this dinner, just to ask generally if he remembered a case matching Emma's rough details. He confirmed it was hers. He also mentioned, and I think this matters here, that in 20 years of running that program, Emma's case was one of maybe 3 he'd ever personally taken time out of his own schedule to review filing by filing, because the pattern of abuse documented in the police reports was severe enough that he wanted to make absolutely certain nothing slipped through. My mother's face had gone through several stages by then: confusion, something closer to embarrassment, and finally something that looked almost like fear. The specific fear of a person realizing they've insulted someone in front of exactly the wrong witness. I didn't know, she said quietly, her voice smaller than I'd heard it in years. You didn't ask? I said, finding my voice for the first time since she'd said the words damaged goods, my hands finally steady where they'd been shaking under the table moments earlier. You've called me things like that for 6 years at every family gathering and every sideways comment, and you never once asked what actually happened in that courtroom or what it cost me to get Maddie somewhere safe. You sat in the back of that hearing and told me you hoped it would settle things down, like I was an inconvenience, instead of your daughter trying to survive something. My father spoke up for the first time that evening, his voice quiet but firm, setting down his own fork with a deliberateness that mirrored Ryan's. Diane? She's right. I sat in that courtroom too. I remember what Kyle's attorney tried to do to her on the stand, how close it came to actually working. I should have said something to you about how you talk about this years ago. I didn't. That's on me too, and I'm sorry it took a stranger's son to say what I should have said myself a long time ago. My mother turned to him, something wounded flashing across her face, like his agreement stung more than Ryan's correction had. You never said anything either, Richard. You sat there just as quiet as I did. My father didn't argue the point. He just nodded, accepting it, which somehow felt more honest than any defense he could have offered. Ryan's phone buzzed on the table, his father checking in, having apparently been thinking about the timing of the dinner all evening, aware his son had planned to bring it up eventually. Ryan glanced at it, then set it face down without answering, a small, deliberate choice that told me more about him than almost anything else that night could have. Have you ever watched someone's cruelty collide completely by accident with the exact person who knew the real story? Sit with that for a second, because I sat at that table watching 6 years of my mother's careful narrative collapse in about 90 seconds, and I still don't fully know how to describe what that felt like, something between vindication and grief for all the years it took to get there. My mother tried briefly to recover the evening offering to bring out dessert. Her voice pitched a little too bright hands, slightly unsteady as she cleared the pot roast plates. Nobody moved to help her the way we normally would. The rest of the dinner passed in a strange, subdued quiet, my mother occasionally attempting small talk, that nobody fully engaged with my father unusually attentive to me in a way he hadn't been in years. Refilling my water glass twice, asking about Maddie's school project like he was trying to make up in real time for a silence he'd kept for too long. Ryan drove me home that night, both of us quiet for the first few miles, the radio off, streetlights sliding past the windshield. Finally, I asked him the question I'd been holding since dinner. Why didn't you tell me sooner? About your dad, about the connection? Because I didn't want you to feel like I was dating you because of some story I already knew the ending to, he said, eyes on the road, his voice careful. I wanted you to tell me on your own terms when you were ready, not because I'd already read the file secondhand through my father's memory of it. Tonight just happened faster than I planned because your mother forced the timeline. I'd honestly hoped it would come up naturally eventually on a much quieter night than that one. I reached over and took his hand the first time all evening I'd felt fully steady. I'm glad it was you sitting across from her tonight, I said. I don't think anyone else could have said what needed saying. My mother called me 3 days later. Her voice smaller than I'd heard it in years, hesitating for several seconds before she said anything at all. She didn't apologize fully. Not at first. She opened by saying she hadn't realized the full extent of everything, which felt like a half measure, but I let her keep talking, sensing she was working her way towards something more honest. Eventually, haltingly, she said the actual words. I'm sorry, Emma. I should have asked, instead of assuming the worst version of your story was the only one worth repeating. It wasn't everything. It was more than she'd ever given me before, and I let myself feel that fully instead of immediately discounting it the way I might have a year earlier. I met Thomas Whitfield properly a month later at a small dinner Ryan arranged at his parents' home, nervous in a way I hadn't expected to be rehearsing small talk in the car the whole drive over. He was quieter in person than I'd imagined, careful with his words, the kind of attentiveness that made you feel like he was actually listening instead of waiting for his turn to speak. Ryan's mother, Elaine, hugged me warmly at the door, the kind of hug that didn't feel performed, and told me over appetizers that Ryan had talked about me for months before finally bringing me around, which made me laugh in a way that eased some of the nervousness sitting in my chest. Thomas told me gently over coffee after dinner that he remembered my case specifically because of how methodically Kyle's attorney had tried to weaponize my own trauma against me on the stand, painting my fear as instability, my caution as manipulation, and how satisfying it had been professionally to watch that strategy fail completely once the full pattern of documented abuse was laid out for the judge piece by piece, undeniable. You didn't get lucky in that courtroom, he told me, setting down his own cup. You won because the truth was overwhelming once someone finally took the time to lay it all out properly. I just made sure someone did. He paused, then added, I'm glad my son finally worked up the nerve to bring you around properly. Elaine's been asking about you for months. My mother still struggles. Sometimes old habits surfacing in smaller, quieter ways. A comment here, a sideways remark there. But she catches herself now, mostly, and corrects course faster than she used to. Sometimes visibly mid-sentence, like she can hear herself falling back into the old pattern and chooses deliberately to stop. Maddie 8 now adores Ryan, calls him by name with the easy comfort of a kid who's never once felt unsafe around him, climbs into his lap during movie nights like it's the most natural thing in the world. He proposed in October, no mason jars, no grand gesture, just a quiet evening at my apartment with Maddie asleep down the hall, which felt exactly right for the life we'd actually built together, unhurried and honest in a way my first marriage never once managed to be. I think about that dinner sometimes, the version of it that could have happened if Ryan's father had been anyone else, if the collision between my mother's cruelty and my own history had never landed on exactly the right witness. I don't know if my mother would have ever corrected course without that accident of circumstance forcing her hand. I'm grateful it did, though I wish, honestly, it hadn't needed to be an accident at all. I wish she'd simply asked years earlier, instead of deciding my survival was something to be ashamed of at every dinner table she ever sat me down at. What would you have done in my place? Tell me in the comments. And if you've ever had your survival called baggage by someone who should have called it strength, tell me what you wish they'd understood instead. I want to know we're not alone in this. My mother spent 6 years deciding my hardest years made me less, and it took one dinner, one name she didn't recognize fast enough, and one quiet man setting down his fork to finally prove exactly what surviving Kyle Bennett had actually made me. I don't share this story looking for sympathy for the years it took to get here. I share it because I think a lot of people carry some version of my mother's voice in their heads, some inherited sentence about what their hardest chapter says about their worth, and I want them to hear clearly that surviving something brutal was never the damage. The damage was always in the person who tried to convince you otherwise, and it took me far too long to understand the difference.